Okay, so here's a story. Sex Pistols were financed by the Soviet Union to destabilize the Western world. That sounds like it is a crazy story, but who knows? You probably don't know this, but the CIA was responsible in part for funding some abstract post-war contemporary art in America. However, we can find out. We can find out pretty quickly. I'm going to show you three different ways to very quickly suss this out. The first way is you can do this trick, right? You can do here's the URL up here. Just get the root domain, then type Wikipedia, and what we'll find on Wikipedia is that the World News Daily Report is a fake news satirical website, right? So not a true story. It's satire or hoax or whatever you want to call it. So that's thing number one. Thing number two, we could take this headline and we could look for this headline like so. And we will find a fact check here by Snopes. We know that Snopes is one of our stops for debunking here, and we find that this is false. So that's way number two. Now, say that Snopes doesn't have anything on this yet. Maybe it's a fresh rumor. Say that Wikipedia doesn't have anything on the site that we're looking at. There's a third way, which is a lot of these hoax stories use photos that they pull from other places. So we can search for this photo here. We do a search for this Google image. Immediately it comes up as KGB because this image has been used prominently as a KGB operative. But that's confirmation bias, right? We want to take that confirmation bias out. We want to replace that with the most generic term possible. Do a search on that. And when we do that, what we find is that this is actually a photo from 2012 of a New Yorker who was walking the streets trying to get people to donate a kidney to his wife. So that is way three. And that's each of these ways, you've noticed, takes about 10 seconds. It's not hard stuff, but it's the sort of stuff that even a lot of prominent reporters don't do. So three techniques. Okay, where can we go from here? If you're teaching your students, you want to do the second part, which we see as dealing with the structural issues. I see a couple structural issues here that are interesting. The first is that when we look at this site, we can see from this site just these stories that come up here are obviously fake stories, right? An Israel man claimed to be a time traveler. If we go down here and we look at these other stories, morgue employee cremated by mistake and so forth. Pretty fake stuff, right? So how did this get shared? Let's see how many times this got shared. Got shared on Facebook 85,000 times. It probably reached, I'm going to guess while it's loading here, I don't know what that is, like 1 million people at least. More, 1.9 million people, right? Almost 2 million people saw this. So how did it get shared so much? Some people probably shared it as a joke. A lot of people shared it seriously. This is what you find, right? The Sex Pistol, you find that it looks no different on Facebook than an article from the New York. So there's a way in which Facebook homogenizes, that is, makes web content look the same when it really is from very different sources. And part of what we have to think about when we think about platforms is the way that platforms are doing that, removing and stripping some signals that we might normally use to tell what the original context of the story is. And how can we avoid that, right? You can also have your students think about the ways in which Instagram would homogenize this, in the ways that Twitter would homogenize this. It's not purely a Facebook thing, it's a platform thing. So that's structural issue number one that you can talk about, the ways in which when we share these things, they're stripped of context. I think another thing you could talk about is real disinformation. So this is fake, right? The Sex Pistols being financed by the Soviet Union. But it's not as crazy as you would think. During the Cold War, the Soviets did a lot of things that were classic disinformation that were calculated to create the create the appearance of Western society, Western European society um, falling apart, right? Just disintegrating. And so, well, this particular story isn't true. You could actually talk about some stories that are true, and I'll give you some links to talk about that. But one thing I think about is um, the famous excursion into the graveyard where swastikas were painted on the graves by Russian agents to create the belief or the fear that Nazism was reemerging in late 1950s Europe, right? So classic disinformation campaign. You can talk about that disinformation campaign and talk about how even though this story is crazy, it's not as crazy as you think. A lot of things happened back then that were relatively similar to this. And then maybe a third thing to think about it. Yeah, I always ask, this issue of why do people share this, right? Um, and what makes this viral? And I think in this case, you'd probably find a lot of people who believe that an ex-KGB agent did say this, but it wasn't really true. But it's kind of funny, ha ha, because they like the Sex Pistols, right? So a lot of it is just um, a slight misconception about the piece rather than understanding its satire. Um, yeah, I think probably the people that know who the Sex Pistols are not sharing this because they hate the Sex Pistols, right? So that's an interesting thing as well. And so thinking about how communities use things like this to build their cohesion and what a person is really saying about themselves when they post this. As far as interventions, this is a case where the actual story is quite funny in a way. I mean, it's not brilliant, but it's amusing. Um, Talking about what a proper caption on this would be if you wanted to share this, if you came across this and you wanted to share this. Should you say, "This is great satire" at the top? Is that enough? Is that too much? Is that too obvious? Like, how do you telegraph to your friends, "Hey, this is fun, but it's also false," and have the students come up with some language around this. Also, what language might you use to correct a friend who seems to believe it's true? But so that's good enough. That's your interventions.